Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this Money Mindset for Ecopreneurs webinar that I've put together courtesy of Green Springboard. I want to say thank you so much to Green Springboard for inviting me along and sort of asking me to do this presentation. Thanks, everybody. So I'm Julia Fawsley Grant. I am a coach. I work with really small businesses, founders, ecopreneurs who really focus their business on sort of trying to put the most positive impact they can out into the world, whether they work in environmental sort of projects, whether it's sustainability, whether it's more people focused around their communities. Anything that I can do to support them is kind of what I'm here for, because what I always say to people is I'm never going to have a genius entrepreneurial idea myself, but if I can help those genius entrepreneurs to sort of better their positive impact, remain profitable, remain sane whilst you're sort of trying to juggle the triple bottom line, then sort of that's really what I'm here for. So as I mentioned at the start, this is a webinar all about money mindset for ecopreneurs because it can be a bit thorny. It is being recorded, I should say, so if any of you don't want to be recorded, please do just switch your cameras off. That's absolutely fine. Similarly, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat. What I'll probably do is if they are really pertinent to what I'm talking about there and then, I will address it at that moment. Otherwise, I'll probably leave it at the end so that we can have a really nice chat. I will probably talk for about 35 or so minutes, depending on how warm I get to my subject and how quickly I speak. And then, you know, we'll have time for questions at the end because I'm aware that it's sort of 8 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, so I'm not going to keep you here all night. So yeah, if you've got any questions for the time being, please pop them in the chat. I'd be really happy to get to them. Otherwise, I think there might be a few more people joining sort of as we go along, but I mean, we can just see. I know that Jean and Davey will be watching in the future. So hello, time travelers. Nice to have you along. So I think probably without further ado, I'll probably just get cracking. So as I said, this is all about how ecopreneurs, positive impact entrepreneurs, founders of small businesses can sort of shift their view slightly around money making, the profit that they make, how they make that profit. Because very often when I'm talking to people in this space, there is such an ick factor around talking about profit margins, gross margins, revenues, turnovers, pricing strategies, you know, all of these issues which are absolutely critical to a properly functioning business really do seem to make people cringe. And I think, you know, I'm not a psychiatrist, but there's a number of reasons around that. A lot of people come into sort of positive impact because they want to see the world move into a slightly better place. And very often money, the financial systems, banking, it gets such a bad rap, and it really is kind of seen as the founding evil, everything that's gone wrong in the whole wide world. And I think to a degree that's true, but we do kind of have to separate big banks, financial systems, those are very exploitative large companies from the like actual tool of money, because the two are absolutely not the same thing. And I think that if we reposition money as a tool rather than money as sort of an evil, that puts us in a much stronger position to actually use money as it's designed for, rather than just feeling really awkward about talking about it and actually making it. So that's the position I come at it from, really very much. How are you using your money? It's your choice. Yes, you can fundamentally disagree with the way that other people choose to spend their money, use their money, invest their money, all of these things. But all of us have agency over the money that we're making, how we invest it, so on and so forth. So you shouldn't feel cringy about what you're doing with the money that you are making through your business, if that train of thought makes sense. And also, I think the really sort of important thing to note here is you're a business, you're not a not-for-profit, you're not a charity. So if you're not a not-for-profit, you are a for-profit. And it's very difficult to be a viable business if you're not actually making a profit. You you know, even if you're scraping by, you're covering your overheads, you're covering your staff costs, all of the absolute basics. At the end of the day, if you don't have a healthy profit margin, your business, in sort of the broadest sense of the term, isn't going to be sustainable. So without meaning to be reductive about it, if you're not making money, you don't actually have a business, which sounds a little bit tough, but I think sometimes, you know, and I include myself here, because I fundamentally believe that coaching should be accessible to everybody. But if you're not making any money whatsoever off the products that you're selling, off the services that you're providing, you can't keep that business going in the long run. And then how you support the causes that you founded your business to help in the first place. So you do kind of need to be thinking long term. Yes, it's really nice to help everybody immediately, practically for free. But how actually is that going to help you long term strategically to get your business to be the voice that you want it to be, to support the charities, I don't know, the profit shares, all of these things that you want to do? That takes money. So really, I guess my first point is using money as a tool. So what are you actually going to do with your profits? You can reinvest them straight back into your business if that's what you choose to do. You can innovate. I mean, we've all had to pivot, seems to be the hot COVID buzzword. Everybody's had to pivot during COVID. That takes a little bit of money. That doesn't come for free. You can adapt, you can improve. All of these things are choices that you put your money to work for. You know, and what I would say again is, if you want your business to really thrive, you need to have a rainy day fund, because if you want to reach new audiences, you need to invest in your marketing. Yes, now that takes creativity, it takes thought processes, it takes a very human touch to get the marketing right, but also it's not free. Even if it's just things like a few banner ads on Facebook, whatever it might be, that takes money. Similarly, to make sure that you're in a strong legal position, you're in a strong financial position, you need to make sure that you have a lawyer on side if something goes wrong. Now, we all like to think that nothing's ever going to happen, but actually, if we're providing a service to somebody, if we're selling a product, there is always the possibility that somebody will turn around and they're dissatisfied, they don't like what you've provided, and they can actually take you to court. So having a rainy day fund for that horrible scenario that you don't even want to consider is extremely important, because if it comes along and you haven't sort of baked that into your financial planning, it's going to come as a real shock when it does. So even if you really fundamentally disagree with the idea of making money to sort of spend on snazzy things like your marketing or like your, I don't know, it could be anything really, make sure that you've got fundamentals of your business in place and financially solid before you start planning for the future. That's really critical. So similarly, once you've got that foundation in place, think about what you want to be doing long term, because even if you are being extremely generous with your pricing now, if you still want to be in business 2-3 years down the line, your pricing actually has to support those future plans. So how are you making sure that the prices you charge now keep in business 18 months down the line? And I'm not suggesting that everybody wants to scale and be Amazon. Absolutely not. But you have to just make sure that your business keeps ticking over. You might need staffing. You might need a virtual assistant. These are all things that you might not consider with immediate effect, but these will be pertinent again in the future. So in the structure of your pricing, always be considering what you want to do 18 months down the line, not just your immediate concerns right now. You know, those immediate concerns should be baked in to your strategic pricing anyway. What are your overheads? What are your staffing costs? Do you have anybody in retainer? Do you have marketing? That's all great, and that needs to go into the plan that you put in place there and then, but you need a buffer to think about the future, to think about your investments, to think about your innovations. Otherwise, really, you're kind of scrabbling from month to month rather than thinking in a much broader sense of, this is my business and this is what I want to achieve. So you kind of need to tie your financial planning into your much broader planning around the impact that you want to have, the causes that you want to support. I hope that's all making sense. so far. So yeah, really my point number one is use money as a tool, choose wisely, choose in a way that you feel comfortable with and that you think will support the positive impact and the kind of business impacts that you want to be having, and make sure it's done with a very strategic hat on. Very often people they do their financial planning from their heart rather than their head, but unfortunately to sort of remain prosperous and thriving, it needs to come from the head. The last thing I would say on that point is, I'm sure that we're all familiar with John Elkington, who is like a personal hero of mine. He coined the triple bottom line, which is profit, people, planet. And I just think it's really important that even like the godfather of sustainability keeps profit in that sort of equation. Because yes, you look at people, yes, you look at the planet, but if you don't have profit, you don't have a business. So people and planet become redundant because there's no business there to support them. So that's all I would say on that. Does anybody have sort of any questions? I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat so I don't lose any right now. Nope. Okay, great. So we'll move on to the next point, which is, so this, again, I'm not a psychologist, but this is a wee bit of reverse psychology, because I think very often when we're pricing products, a huge barrier that a lot of ecopreneurs, positive impact entrepreneurs come up against is, well, crikey, people won't want to pay for my product. That seems a bit pricey. Is it sort of above the market average? Am I looking greedy here? You know, a lot of kind of chit chat goes on in people's heads around the final price that they fall on. So what I would say is, let's flip this around. You already have an engaged audience of consumers, buyers, clients, whatever you care to call them. If you are prepared to pay X amount for a certain product, why not your customers, if they're already really interested in what you're doing? You know, all of us here on this webinar and sort of people who are watching it in the future, I assume, are prepared to pay a wee bit more for a product from a company whose ethical, moral agenda is far more robust than a bigger company, probably, that has a slightly more sort of, you could really quibble why it's in business and what it's doing. We're prepared to pay for that cost differential because we agree with the ethos of the company. It's not just the product, it's the whole sort of package that comes along with it. If we're prepared to do that, then why not your customers? Why not your consumers? And I just think it's a really interesting sort of way of changing our perspectives on the way people choose to use their money. I don't have stats to hand, which is very mal-prepared of me. But Ethical Consumer magazine, last April, I think it was, they published their 20 years of ethical consumerism report, which, I mean, as it suggests, it's from 1999 to 2019. They looked at sort of ethical spending across the board, whether it was home energy, whether it was beauty products. I think they looked at travel, you know, a really broad spectrum of different parameters around shopping. And back in 1999, ethically purchased goods were about £11.7 billion in the UK market. 20 years later, it's over £40 billion. So, I mean, that jump over 20 years is absolutely gigantic. And yes, people pick and choose whether they want to use renewable energy, whether they want to make sure that they're using fair trade coffee, whether it's handmade soap, all of those things. But sort of what I'm getting at is ethical consumerism is an enormous growth market, and it's only going to carry on getting bigger. So people really are choosing to put their money where their mouth is. And we, you know, all of us here, we're on the right track because we've already decided that the business that we're running is going to be founded on ethical considerations, sustainability, all of those things. This is what people are looking for. This is the future. So I don't think that you should sort of be worrying about your prices. I think really it needs to be more sort of, well, people are already interested. My pricing is correct, provided you've done your market research, all of those things. I wouldn't actually give it a second thought and worry about whether people are prepared to pay, because fundamentally they are. The interesting thing was Ethical Consumer did a follow-up to that report at the end of the first lockdown, I think it was. Now, this research was based more on, excuse me, was based more on what people were going to do rather than what they were actually doing. And, you know, again, there was a huge uptick in people's interest around fair trade products, around making sure that they were shopping locally, around making sure that what they were buying actually wasn't damaging to biodiversity. You know, there was a real sort of renewed interest in these considerations, which, I mean, as we enter the new normal, I can't say for sure that that interest is going to continue, but I just found it fascinating that actually in the sort of, what was it, April to June time last year, people really started engaging again in a very serious way as to what their money could do in terms of the impact it was having. So I don't think that sort of pricing needs to be a consideration, really, because people are engaged, people are there, people want to feel like they are spending their money with something that's going to do good rather than just buying an object and that's that. Yes, and actually, if anybody wants the Ethical Consumer stats, I'm really happy to send it around because it's a really, really interesting, informative read. They always do such good research. It was brilliant. So that is sort of around just put yourself in the shoes of your consumers because it's a really, really illuminating viewpoint. So my next point is, now I'm not going to do enforced fun because I hate team sports, but it's always interesting when you sort of take a step back and you look at your brand values. What is it that you want people to associate with your brand? I think for most of us, it will be a really strong set of sort of business ethics. We make sure that we give back or we donate or we do a profit share, whatever it might be. If we are in the business of products, it's making sure we have a really robust supply chain. We know what we're paying our workers. We know where we're shipping things from. You know, a real level of transparency and a real level of responsibility around the money that we're making. If you, again, turn it on its head slightly, if you just sort of try and think of 3 companies that really pride themselves on cheap, fast, and convenient. Now, I always come up with really boring, obvious ones, which are Tesco, Zara, and Ryanair, and Amazon. You always have to throw Amazon into the mix. And basically, yes, those businesses are absolutely cheap as chips, but they are also associated with really poor worker rights, dreadful worker pay. There's plastic packaging anywhere. There's a sort of real disrespect for how they treat their animal, their livestock, their supply chains are completely opaque. I mean, you've got no idea where anything comes from. They are not positive values that people love. The only thing people like about those companies is the fact that they're not very expensive. So really the point here is cheap at the point of purchase covers up an absolute multitude of other expenses which can't necessarily be defined in financial terms, which I think we're all becoming much more aware of. I mean, particularly us here on this call, and sort of more broadly, consumers know that like a $1.99 chicken from Tesco is actually a horrendous way to sort of eat meat, be part of the consumer supply chain, all the rest of it. It's just not sustainable, but they buy it because it's cheap. So do you want to be aligning your brand values, your company, with what is, you know, essentially it's a race to the bottom, because the more you undercut your competitor, the more corners that you have to cut, the more sort of, the more you kind of cheapen your product by not staying true to the values that you want to uphold. So I would say really, people are very aware now what cheap means. How do you want your business to look? And if, you know, if you want it to be cheap and you want it to be accessible to everybody based on price alone, that's entirely your choice. Again, the choices that you make around your money are yours alone. But people respect a company that actually stands up for its values, and they appreciate the fact that the money that you're making through the prices that you're charging, you're standing up for people that actually they can't necessarily help. So you're kind of championing causes that people can then vicariously champion themselves. And, you know, sort of, I'll move on to my next point in a moment, but really that championing, that really responsible use of money should play into your marketing. It should play into your communications. And actually another coach that I who works in this space called Kat Luckock, I don't know if anybody of you know her. She has this wonderful phrase, which is, you cannot support your vision for social change in a better world unless you do it through your pricing. And I've completely mangled that. But sort of what she says is absolutely spot on, because we can't make any changes whatsoever. We can't sort of be that champion. We can't sort of stand up and say, well, actually, this is our vision for positive social change, by then completely undercutting our credibility and being as cheap as chips. Pricing is a huge part of what drives change. Like I was saying, sort of in terms of innovation, marketing, finances, legal, etc., etc. Similarly, you can't do anything without money. You can't drive positive change. You can't contribute to charities. You can't do profit shares, any of those things, if your only parameter is being cheap, because that leaves absolutely no buffer whatsoever for doing the things that you want to do with your extra money. So at this stage, I'm going to do a nerdy detour into semantics, because I think this is really, really important. A huge problem I think that a lot of people have in terms of talking about money, profit, etc., is actually the word profit. We really cringe when we ask us, what's your profit margin? How much profit do you make? Now, actually, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the definition of profit is literally the difference in the amount earned and the amount spent in buying, operating, or producing something. It's literally the difference between what you charge, remove all of your overheads and your costs, and what's left. The important point here is that the other word that I think we conflate profit with is profiteering, which again, same Oxford English Dictionary. Profiteering is making or seeking to make an excessive or unfair profit. And I think that's the key. I think profiteering is what we're all trying to avoid. We don't want to take advantage of a situation. We don't want to manipulate people. We don't want to think, I'm taking advantage of kind people who want to sort of buy ethical products and making too much money off them. That's profiteering. But if you are simply making a profit, then that's completely neutral. Oh, don't worry, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining us. If you are simply making a profit, that is an entirely ethical, laudable thing to do, because that's the point of a business. It's when you cross the line into profiteering, which is when you start taking advantage of that kindness, of that interest in people who want to actually make a difference. So, as I say, I think that, I know that's a bit geeky, but I think words really matter. And I think when you're talking about profit, don't confuse it with profiteering, because the two are completely different. And it's really important to make sure that you get that right when you're discussing these things. So yeah, Oxford English Dictionary is always a help when you're sort of thinking about these things, because words actually matter. So the next thing I would say, and this is sort of related really to, you know, cheap covers up an absolute multitude of sins. On the flip side, fair pricing is a really virtuous circle, because mass-produced, I don't know, sort of manufactured in some really opaque supply chain, all the rest of these things, that $1.99 chicken, as I say, is such an expensive item in, you know, in terms of so many different things. So, you know, if you're going to price your goods, if you're going to price your services fairly, that puts you in an upward spiral. So really, once you've founded your business, once you've got your pricing strategy correct, you need to be making sure that the money that you're making, that you know, hopefully you're finally feeling comfortable to make, what then are you actually going to do with that to make sure that you are driving the change that you want to see? Now, you know, this isn't for me to say, really, it's entirely up to you. It depends on what your business is. It depends on where your passions lie. But you can only make those changes if you're actually making a profit and you're baking the margin into that profit to share it, to donate it, to pay the living wage or to pay above living wage. it's really important to sort of support that. And what I would say is, don't forget yourself in this equation. And again, I'm completely guilty of this. We're all so busy trying to be social champions, to be eco warriors, etc., that I think very often we forget to pay ourselves a living wage. And without meaning to sound like Oprah Winfrey, you kind of need to set the example yourself. So if you're not paying yourself a living wage, how on earth can you sort of expect other people to pay themselves a living wage or kind of respect what you're doing? You have to put your money where your mouth is as an entrepreneur to be that example and kind of lead the way. So yeah, it has to be a virtuous circle, and kind of has to start with you as the founder, as the entrepreneur. Yeah, really important. So sorry, I realised that I've literally just talked at you for half an hour. I hope this is all making sense. And if you've got questions, you've got them in your back pockets. The last thing I would say, which is really, really important, and it's so much easier said than done, is whether you're service-based, whether you are product-based, you need to be really proud of your prices, because if you hide behind a price, if you try and sort of pretend they're not really the price that it is, people really pick up on that, and it's, it's very, very off-putting. But actually, you can weave a really lovely message into your pricing, obviously depending on what it is that you do. And what I always say to people is, you don't need to defend your prices, because if you're defending something, that suggests that there is something there that needs defending, which kind of implies you're doing something wrong. What you need to be doing is you need to be educating, communicating, and explaining to your customers, to your clients, why your prices are what they are. And I always use Rajasthani textiles as like a really obvious example, but you could use, I don't know, Kenyan coffee beans, you can use handmade soy soap, you can use, I don't know, beautiful face creams made from lavender oil, whatever it is that you're doing, you can use this as exactly the same template. Basically, as part of your marketing, you can explain to people why you're paying a fair wage to the people producing your goods, why your sort of constituent ingredients, which are fair trade potentially, which are organic, which are locally produced, they are all far more expensive than batch produced, manufactured, whatever it might be. So how do you integrate the different parts of your supply chain or the different parts of your sort of services to make sure that you are explaining, educating, communicating all the different parts of the process that come up to that final price? Because I think that way, A, you are reasoning with people as to why you come to that final price in the first place, but B, they can then see that actually the product that you're selling them has this amazing back history, and it's incredibly compelling because it makes people realize actually the amount of effort that goes into that final product on the shelf. It makes them realize that it doesn't just sort of pop up out of nowhere. There is, there's the supply chain behind it. There are people who work really hard to bring this product to them. They need to be paid. If you want to, I don't know, packaging, compostable packaging, that's more expensive than plastic. These are all really tangible, positive, and as I say, compelling reasons as to why your prices might be slightly higher than what you might be comfortable charging, or, what you see on the shelf at Boots, for example. So if you weave an element of storytelling into your marketing that feeds into your prices, that sort of really puts a lovely spin on how authentic you are. It kind of embellishes your credentials because it's very transparent what you're doing. And at the end of the day, it explains why your prices are what your prices are, if that makes sense. So I do think that's really important. And not everybody can do it because they might not have, they might not have enough products to do that. They might be services based and it's really difficult to do that. But I think of an element of really communicating your value to people in a really upfront, honest way, actually makes people more interested in what you do, and it makes them more likely to spend with you because they can really see every aspect of what you're doing and why that sort of final price when it pops up is, and I'm not going to use the word defensible, but it's realistic, it's fair, and it has actually far more impact than just, going into somebody's bank account. So I think pride in your prices is probably a really nice place to stop, because that sort of funnels in everything that we've been talking about in terms of, you know, making sure that you are using your money effectively. It's your money, it's your choice, do with it what you will, but it's a tool rather than an evil in itself. Remembering what your customers and clients are prepared to pay, because if you're prepared to pay, if you're prepared to kind of vote with your wallet, very likely so are they. Cheap is not cheap. It's incredibly expensive. It's just we can't define it in terms of actual money, because sadly, impact is only valued in terms of finances. We don't yet have the metrics, or we don't yet have sort of a standardized set of metrics for looking at ecological costs, for looking at personal costs, all of those things. And it's a virtuous circle. So, you know, using that money, putting it back into your community, making sure that you are planting a tree, or, you know, whatever it is that you're doing, that sort of starts a virtuous circle that you can then feed into your marketing, that explains your prices and really helps to communicate your value to your customers or your clients. Did that all make sense, I hope? Just a nod would be great. Does anybody have any questions kind of in the forum now? Because there are a few people who couldn't make it, unfortunately, who sent in a couple of questions. So I'll answer those kind of towards the end. But if any of you guys have a question now, please just pop it in the chat, or if you're happy to be recorded, come off mute. Nope. Okay. Okay, so I just had a couple of questions, and actually I already mentioned this to the Green Springboard team, but one of the best questions I ever had, which I'm not going to attempt to answer this evening, is how do you structure your pricing if you fundamentally don't believe in the concept of money? Which really stumped me, actually. I didn't really know what to say. Yes, wow, exactly. So I hope that none of you have got anything quite so philosophical up your sleeves, because I can't answer that one. I think it's a fascinating PhD study, but rather above my pay grade. So a question that I get asked a lot actually is, well, how do you know that you're charging a fair price? And I always give a really, really unsatisfactory answer, which is you have to do your research. It always surprises me, but the number of people that sort of come into this and they have a rough idea of what they're going to charge, but they haven't really looked at their competitors, at their peers, at the market. They haven't totted up all of their overheads. You can't charge any price whatsoever unless you've really done an awful lot of research into what the market can support, both sort of, I would say, the ethical market and the unethical market. See what the cost differential there is. Make sure that you are positioning yourselves, obviously, at the ethical end of the scale. So kind of do broad intelligence gathering first, and then start looking at your actual overheads, because obviously market research is great, but if you come up with a price based on that rather than actually what you're spending and what your outlay is, the two might not tally very well. So really, once you've done your market intelligence, then have a really good look at your full supply chain, whatever it is. Yes, factor in your products, factor in the pay, factor in the logistics, factor in the packaging, all of these things. But also, if you work from home, make sure that you're looking at your energy bills, because the number of people who don't factor that in, and I'm like, well, how do you pay your bills? How are you paying for your Wi-Fi? How are you connecting with your customers? Just be really, really granular about all of the costs that are implied in bringing that final product to market. And then obviously it's difficult to calculate a gross margin. And I would say this really does vary from market to market. And I can't advise on, again, whether it's soaps, whether it's textiles, but there's so much sort of information out there. Just make sure that you are sort of doing the standard profit margin within your area, and then adding a little bit on, determined by what it is that you're sort of working on long term, whether you need to be rejigging your marketing, whether you need to be making sure you've got your rainy day fund. put that buffer in there on top of your profit margin to make sure that you can cover everything comfortably and you have more to innovate, invest, etc., etc. So that's the question that I really often come across, actually. And I did see something in the chat. Hang on. So this is from Pippa. Do you find the majority of companies in this space donate to charity? Is this an expectation? That's a really good question. The answer is yes, I do. And it is an expectation, actually. And do you know what, this is a really good point, because I think that sort of as we move into the new normal, it's almost going to become a matter of business expectations. People expect companies to be doing something good with the profit that they're making. And actually, I think increasingly, there will be a shrinking number of companies that don't do anything, and they're really poorly looked on, and people will actually start looking elsewhere for the products and services that they provide because they don't agree with that ethos. So yes, whether it's a donation to charity, whether it's a profit share, a lot of people do 1% for the planet, which is a really lovely way of giving back. Loads of people do, I don't know, buy a pair of pants and we will plant a tree. You know, there's loads of really lovely, creative, interesting ways of doing it. But yes, pretty much everybody that I deal with donates to charity in some way. Yeah, exactly. You could do pro bono work without blowing my own trumpet. That's what I do. Because actually, sometimes money isn't what people need. It's expertise, it's help, it's market knowledge. Yes, you can buy that. Of course you can. You can buy it from consultants. But actually just exactly sharing knowledge and time is just as valuable as giving a contribution. Because sometimes people need that help, they need that knowledge and they can't afford it. So I think, like, for me, pro bono work and mentoring is an absolutely wonderful way of sort of putting positive impact into the world and kind of not hoarding up all the stuff that you've learnt, because otherwise it's just in your head. Why not share it? And one thing I often encourage companies to do actually is to try a mentor scheme, because if you can help other people get a leg up, move a little bit further up the pole or whatever it might be, just by giving your knowledge, by sharing an hour a month, I think the impact that has on people is really underestimated, to be honest. There's another question. Oh, so Rachel, I'm a big advocate of transparent pricing, but what level of detail do you go into that you think is most effective? That's such a good question. I don't know what area you work in, but I would say, frankly, in most instances, you can't be too detailed. People love to know what they're spending their money on. They love to know the backstory behind a product. People are so interested in that now. And actually, I was listening to a webinar or something the other day. And interestingly enough, more people are interested in the human impact of what your product does than the environmental impact, because they tally the human impact with what you're doing for the environment. So let's say it's sort of working around, if we're alleviating climate change, which we all are, that actually feeds into an enormous number of disadvantaged or sort of third world countries. So the impact of that goes straight to the people. So I would say the more transparent you can be, absolutely the better. You don't necessarily have to give your accountant's details, for example. That's probably a level too far. But people love a bit of sort of granularity, they love a little bit of data, they love a personal story. That's when they really start to engage with you as a person, because remember, very often they're not buying a product per se, they're buying you and the company. So I wouldn't worry about being too transparent, because I don't think people reach that level truly. Cool. The other thing I was going to say is I have a little sort of crib sheet. It's literally the 5 bullet points that I've been through, which I'm really happy to send around to anyone. And if you've got any questions, just pop me an email, because I'm aware that was a bit of a data dump. I'm sure I forgot something absolutely critical, which I'll remember at 3 o'clock in the morning. But yeah, if you think of any questions after we've hung up, I'm really, really happy to answer them and, funnel them through Green Springboard. Thank you all so much for coming. This has been an absolute pleasure. As I say, if you've got any more questions, please send them through to Green Springboard. They will send them on to me.